Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, 3 weeks after residents were allowed back to Alberton, the contaminated soil was finally removed, and many people reported being re-exposed during the removal. Meanwhile, some residents continued to stay away, intolerant of returning home. We now conclude Part 2, Aftermath, with Chapter 6, Holdouts. Epigraph. This is a town that is sick. This is a town that is shattered. It's fragmented, people against people. There isn't that warm feeling that you have anymore, that you knew the people. Robbie Flynn. Lucinda Hodges feared returning, but she now felt sick around certain chemicals anywhere. At the motel, the things that bothered me worse, she said, I was getting double vision. A couple of times she felt incapable of driving. Other people were telling me they were having the same thing. Night sweats, not being able to sleep. My whole body changed just like that. I was a mess. Hodges was on prednisone, which induced weight gain. She was still getting body rashes. I started having tremors all over my body. I was just shaking and I couldn't stop. And Western Montana Clinic says it was post-traumatic stress. I felt that it wasn't stress. By May, she was on an inhaler. I was having trouble breathing by that point. It took till about May till I lost my voice. And it wasn't at all like MRL said, that it would all go away. I'd pick up the phone and start coughing. I couldn't breathe and talk. And they would all say, "Oh, Lucinda, it's you. Take your time." Hodges' kids still got leg rashes and mouth sores, but she thought they were otherwise all right. When Mark Hansen returned to Alberton to work nearby, he developed some flu-like symptoms, dizziness and headaches. Hansen just tried to work because they desperately needed money. Hodges stayed out of Alberton. MRL sent Hodges to Dr. Steve Johnson, a neurologist with Western Montana Clinic. He referred me to a psychiatrist, she said. Johnson said he couldn't find anything wrong with me except I was Costco-phobic because I would always get sick when I went to Costco. I told him it was because of all the pesticides and the chemicals. He said, I have an odor behavior problem and that I should have odor behavior therapy. He said, you should start by going out and shopping for new things. Go and look at new cars, new motorhomes, new mobile homes, boats, and expose yourself to these odors that you have around new things. Eventually, you'll get used to it, he said. That new thing smell meant chemicals. That will begin getting over your behavior problems with odors, he said. I definitely thought he was saying it's a psychological problem, purely. He calls it a mild chlorine exposure, Hodges said. That just cracks me up. Hodges refused this therapy. If you were having a problem with your health and it wasn't going away in a few weeks, then you had to see Johnson, she said. Once Dr. Johnson made his decision, then they cut you off. MRL stopped paying medical bills. And most people were getting a diagnosis from him of crazy, depressed, that kind of thing, she said. MRL's medical claims officer, John Barlow, funneled many people to the neurologist. I don't know anyone who actually got a test, she said. You knew you were going to the company man. By Johnson's own dictated consultation notes on June 14, 1996, he reported Hodges as much better, but with sensitivity to odors. Exposures to certain odors seems to set off cough, watery eyes, and skin problems, he wrote, such as during visits to Costco and other stores. She was only able to stay a few minutes in those stores, but felt much better when she got out. 2 weeks ago, she tried to return to Alberton. She went back in the evening and was feeling really good, but after about 30 minutes, her sinuses pounded, her eyes burned, and it took her 5 days to recuperate from that exposure. She does admit to being quite scared by this episode, but denies that she has had any previous serious incidents of this type before. Johnson also noted of Hodges, she did notice some difficulty breathing when she was home. She was home for an hour and a half, I think, and had 5 days of worsened symptoms as a consequence of that. She was treated with systemic steroids and subsequently inhaled steroids and beta agonists, and actually feels like her chest is doing pretty well at the moment. She is quite concerned about chemical sensitivities and the sense of loss involved with the change in her lifestyle recently, and anxieties about not being able to go home. Johnson's analysis: 1. Mild chlorine exposure, mostly resolved. 2. Hypersensitivity to odors, probably a conditioned reflex related to chlorine exposure. Johnson's discussion, as he wrote, strangely, this woman now seems to tolerate the odor of chlorine, but she becomes quite phobic when she discusses pesticides and insecticides, which Costco apparently is rife with. When we discuss reflexes and methods of extinguishing a reflex, her interpretation is, I am trying to get her used to toxic substances. I have a real physical problem here, not just a reflex, and I'm afraid that trying to extinguish the reflex will really make me worse, she indicates. Regarding behavioral conditioning and deconditioning, Johnson noted there's comparatively little work for odors. The other classical technique for deconditioning is simply extinguishment, but it is unclear how long she would have to be away from Alberton before things were extinguished. Even though her husband has moved back into the house and seems to be doing fine, she has the feeling that the whole town of Alberton is a toxic waste site where it is unsafe to return. At the same time, she also believes that there must be a physical explanation for her current reactions. I believe there is a physical explanation, namely a change in the illegible of her neural network so that she has a reflex reaction to odors. As far as extinguishing the reflex, she was going to need a longer time out of Alberton. Johnson thought Hodges' hypersensitivity a conditioned reflexive reaction and related it to odors, not chemicals. In effect, it was all in her head. That's just bad therapeutics, evacuee and psychotherapist Vic Stampley said of Hodges' coscophobia diagnosis, that victims needed to expose themselves to various smells to overcome a presumed psychological problem. Theoretically, he said, it's called stress inoculation. It's bad psychology in the long run, because that is just not how you get people over things. If you really want people to recover from something, you send them to practitioners that are not going to dismiss somebody's experience, no matter what it is. I'm willing to sit here and say, I don't know to what extent my experience is what we call psychosomatic, and to what extent we call it biochemical. I don't know, but I sure don't want somebody to tell me, you are hallucinating. Go out there and snort naugahyde until you get over it. When Ace requested that MRL bring in a chlorine medical specialist, MRL told Hodges they couldn't find an expert in chlorine. 2 weeks later, she said, Dr. Kilburn found us. Dr. Kaye Kilburn of the University of Southern California School of Medicine was a highly accomplished but controversial researcher who attributed neurological damage to toxic exposures. For chlorine, he had studied victims of the Henderson, Nevada spill and various other small-scale exposures. After hearing about Alberton, Kilburn contacted MRL, Ellen Leahy of the Health Department, and ATSDR about interest in funding a clinical study. He also contacted potential lawyers for spill victims. He wrote that the tragedy of the spill offered the opportunity to measure and understand the full effects of chlorine on an unselected population of human subjects. Most important is the possibility of improving the fate of the exposed group with appropriate intervention. A treating physician, Kilburn wanted to conduct respiratory and neurological testing of Alberton victims. ATSDR had no interest. In late April, Leahy replied, I recall you mentioning that an attorney may provide some of the funding for the study. Certainly, we will not lend our name to an effort we are not sponsoring. Kilburn argued that attorneys were often the only recourse for funding in the crucial weeks following catastrophic contamination. No one planned chlorine exposures. Morbid as it was, opportunity had knocked, and the whole point of testing was to help people. Kilburn wrote a similar letter to BNSF and MRL. Neither replied. He seemed to have little choice but plaintiff lawyers for funding his research. Leahy recalled, I saw him as angling to be an expert witness. But Kilburn didn't simply opine. He tested Alberton spill victims. Kilburn heard about ACE and contacted Hodges. I told him about the symptoms, Hodges recalled, and he said, "Oh my God, already? I didn't think it would hit people this fast." But I said, "You know what I'm talking about? It's real?" He said, "Oh, absolutely. This is real. I can document this." Hodges talked with Kilburn several times by phone. He was the first physician who had knowledge about chemicals that we met that was willingly open to sharing that knowledge and give us the truth, even if it was an ugly truth. That truth was, you won't get better, you'll probably get worse. And I really respected that about Dr. Kilburn. At least you knew where you stood. Kilburn took time to explain chemical exposure and earned Hodges' trust. As reported in the Missoulian, Kilburn began neurological testing of up to 95 victims of the spill, hoping to create a medical baseline for further testing to document any long-term effects. Doctors have been taught that this is an irritant gas, with the presumption that it's like any other burn. Tissue is damaged, but it eventually heals, Kilburn told the paper. But Kilburn had found neurological and respiratory symptoms persisting in most of 20 chlorine patients he had studied in the past. Early June, Kilburn put Alberton victims through a 3-hour battery, including tests to measure performance in vision, hearing, memory, problem-solving skills, and motor skills. Attorneys paid for the $1,000 per person testing. Kilburn said that about half the people tested were clients and half were unrepresented. When you bring up Dr. Kilburn's name, the general reaction is that he's a shark, Hodges recalled, seeking money from attorneys. The reality is that research is expensive, she said. That's why an ATSDR study costs $300,000. Dr. Kilburn's work cost a whole lot less than that, and it was valid, and offered quick results. It didn't take him 2.5 years to put together a 34-page study like it did ATSDR, Hodges said. The fledgling ACE continued to meet both inside and out of Alberton, in deference to people unable to tolerate going home. Beverly Ridenauer only got involved with ACE after an attempt to get reimbursed for out-of-pocket expenses at the claims office in Alberton. "That's when they nailed you," she said. "When I got there, he opened his little folder like he was going to take care of it. He had a check in that folder made out to me and my husband for $500, and a big piece of paper which was a release, releasing them from all liability. When she told him she wanted an attorney to review the document because she was only there for out-of-pocket expenses, he said, 'Well, I can't reimburse you for those until you sign this.'" Ridenauer contacted an attorney. "If I'd signed that paper," she said, "I would have signed away everything for $500. And $500 wouldn't have paid for our medicine for 2 months." Ridenauer had heard of a gentleman in Alberton who was a railroad retiree, she said, and they got him to settle for $100. "That has stuck in my craw." EPA's Chris Weiss reflected, "This is what's so frustrating after seeing train wreck after train wreck after train wreck. You have to question the wisdom of taking that short-term payment for possible chronic illness that affects you for the rest of your life." A month after the spill, the Missoulian published the first and only opinion article by an evacuee, Tamara Hatch. She reiterated her claim from an earlier interview that a claims adjuster refused to give her $400 for out-of-pocket expenses without her signing off. "The problem with my signing that piece of paper," Hatch wrote, "is that MRL is responsible for what's happened in this beautiful little community, responsible for the people spitting up blood, responsible for the woman whose throat is so burned she can't eat, responsible for the people with pneumonia, responsible for the man with holes in his eye tissue. How can I or should I be sure that nothing else will pop up as a result of the chlorine spill? Who is going to guarantee that people who are ill will be okay?" Later, Hatch said she felt the media dropped Alberton after general reentry. "It surprised me how quickly it became yesterday's news, and that there was so much that wasn't said." Hatch wrote her opinion piece partly because so many of the stories you read about talked about the people that were taking advantage, the people that were eating lobster and steak. It really made Alberton sound foolish in a lot of ways, she said. She had talked to a Missoula librarian about friends still ill, and she said, "Tamara, from everything I've read, everybody's fine." And I said, "Well, they're not fine. There's a lot of very sick people and very good people that are suffering." She said, Well, that's not the impression I'm getting. In fact, in the Missoulian, other than the train crew and some people on the highway, there was very little information in general about how spill victims were doing. Information about the effect on people's health was very vague. It was very vague, Hatch said. It was almost, people laughed at Alberton in ways. They made fun of the fact that people were out eating steak and lobster. I heard the comments all the time. I became embarrassed to go into a cafe and sign on to have MRL pay during the evacuation. Later, no one seemed to understand that the Alberton spill was an ongoing tragedy. Hodges said ACE had a couple hundred members at the start, with a good core of about 20. But people got scattered to the wind very quickly, she said, the minute we went home. While Hodges kept in touch from Missoula, local activists continued to work with ACE, which sought outside help because its members were inexperienced and ill. In early June, student activists wrote a press release that said, in part, evacuated residents were told by MRL-hired doctors that, except for those with pre-existing pulmonary problems, they could expect a rapid and complete recovery from their chlorine exposure. However, Alberton residents who returned home are still today reporting symptoms such as headaches, joint aches, burning sensations, difficulty breathing, and spitting or coughing up blood. Several have again left their homes. ACE sought grant money so they could analyze available data from environmental tests, conduct door-to-door outreach toward victims, and pay organizers and trainers to help ACE become a self-supporting nonprofit. They wanted to build a community support network offering health, environmental, and legal information, and provide referrals for physical, mental health, and legal needs. The ACE mission statement was written for the grant. We formed to assist community members whose quality of life has been impacted by this toxic spill. The core of ACE's mission is to quickly, simply, and completely reestablish the Alberton area as a safe, clean, self-empowered community, one whose peace of mind is fully restored. But most of the hands-on activist help dried up with the end of some grant money that summer. By June, ACE meetings only drew about 15 people. Some key families had dropped out, like the Criscos. With Hodges and others still self-evacuated, the Alberton ACE office was often vacant. Once a week, Paris Young would sit in the office, and that didn't sit well with many residents. People would complain big time, Hodges said. He's being perceived as a hippie who's never had a job. ACE had many things going against it. Mainly, it was composed of people complaining. Unsurprisingly, ACE also had a spectrum of members, including some perceived by staid locals as outsiders or hippies, or who were associated with drug use. ACE also allied itself with Dr. Kilburn, perceived by officials as a toxic injury chaser. As for student activists, environmentalism was a dirty word for many Montanans. To a conservative railroad town, ACE looked like the wrong kind of club altogether. On May 29, the Missoulian ran a brief back-page report on residents who claimed that returning to Alberton made them feel ill. Hodges, spokesperson for ACE, said that after visiting Alberton for an ACE meeting, her burning skin and eyes forced her out of town, back to her Missoula motel. I guess I'm allergic to my hometown now, she said. I have a feeling that I won't be going back for a while. MRL reported still housing 12 Alberton residents, a few families. However, an unspecified number of other people not on MRL's motel bill also stayed out. This short article was the closest the Missoulian ventured to investigating ongoing health complaints. Hodges recalled, once we went home, there was virtually no coverage. That's been very frustrating, that we haven't had the media attention to get the message out that, look, we're still hurt. Alberton sculptor Jabe Jackson had his latest sculpture featured in the June 17 Missoulian, called Neotoxicosis. A life-size, chrome-eyed woman of steel with one hand clutched at her throat and mouth agape in agony, her other arm outstretched to the sky. For those who have returned to Alberton, the statue is a symbol of their helplessness, Jackson said. Jackson and his wife said they would have stayed out of Alberton if they could afford it. Jackson still had bronchitis and burning eyes. Following the announcement of the cleanup at the spill site, the Alberton incident faded from the news. Alberton celebrated its 11th annual Railroad Days on the third Saturday of July as usual, with a parade and lots of food. As for the chlorine spill, the Missoulian reported succinctly, most people completely recovered, a few have lingering problems, the incident divided loyalties and friends. There was no further publication in the Missoulian of spill-related news that summer. The day loomed when Hodges would have to try and live again on Railroad Street. On July 1, Hodges left the motel. I said, I got to get my family out of here. Emerald claims agents agreed to her request for a short-term rental and offered to pay $800 a month. They contacted a furniture store for her as well, so she signed the paperwork to rent a house. Stupid me, she said. This was all just verbal agreement. When she went to get the money, Emerald's Alan Anderson told her, we've changed our mind. I was so committed to what I was doing, I went and used my own money. I thought it would get worked out. After Emerald's bait and switch, Hodges didn't know if she could go back to the hotel or not. But I just couldn't face the hotel anymore, she said. The cramped living. And that's when I signed on with attorney William Rossback when they did this to me. And he said, oh, they'd get it straightened out right away. Of course, he didn't, and I stayed 1 month in that house. Rossback told me I should go home. He said, if you don't try, we don't have a case. And I didn't have any more money. Emerald had stopped paying, and Hodges' out-of-pocket expenses ran $4,000 to $5,000. Hodges originally assumed her costs for staying out would ultimately be covered. I just didn't think that they could possibly do what they did to us and get away with it. I didn't think it was legal. That they could not pay 1 penny, not make any compensation, even if you didn't go home, if you were sick. It just never would have dawned on me. I didn't believe them on the safety and health stuff, but I did think that somehow, legally, I was protected. I was dumb. Maybe I believed it because it was the only way I could survive. That if I'd have accepted the reality that they were going to totally strand me, I just don't know that I could have taken it. Being in the rental home seemed to help some. In July, Hodges said, I really felt I gained some health. In preparation for a return to her Alberton home, Mark started tearing the place up for me, she said, to try and clean the house. Hodges first tried 20-minute spells at home to try and acclimate, with Hanson prepared to evacuate her. She usually couldn't stay long. I would get very ill. I had the rash again, the headaches, the nausea, the fatigue, like you're getting the flu. That's when I started getting the joint problems and the muscle pain, the third or fourth day after going out to Alberton like that. My hips, my knees, terrible pain. Ankles, just a stiffness, but like a bone pain. Hanson, she said, took the curtains, all the beds, the carpets, the baseboards, everything. He ripped everything out. However, he couldn't get the smell out. I just think of all the terrible things we did trying to make this work, and how stupid it was. She couldn't even get the smell out of her Aerostar van. I think the going home part has always been most traumatic for me, that I couldn't go home, that we tried so hard and that we ruined our house in the process. Her old Merc. If Hodges had known what lay ahead of her, she never would have attempted her return to Alberton. A friend of Hodges, Fran Russo, visited Montana with her family every year and paid Hodges a visit that summer. Fran and Al Russo had 4 kids and motored in a trailer. Hodges was a visitor herself to Alberton those days, home to do some cleaning. Russo hadn't heard how the spill affected her friend until she called ahead before arriving one afternoon. There was a mild smell in the air. Later, as everyone passed through the ground level of the house, Russo noticed just a terrible odor. Black garbage bags bulged with household items Hodges had bagged until she decided whether to throw them away. The Russells spent most of their visit outside or in their motorhome that day and went to bed around 10 or 11 p.m. with the RV windows open. They planned on leaving the next morning. Earlier, before bedtime, Russell's 7-year-old son began coughing. One daughter felt nauseous. Then sometime that night, Russell woke to the sound of her husband starting up the vehicle. He had tears in his eyes. He could hardly see. He couldn't breathe. He said, I don't know what's wrong. She tried to stop him from putting the RV in gear. The vehicle was still plugged into the electrical outlet of the house. Al cried, We've just got to get out of here. Russell recalled the smell in the air as maybe like a pesticide. Her eyes started to burn. As they drove off, their kids woke up. My son had the same thing where he couldn't breathe, she said. He had broken out in an itchy rash. They left without telling Hodges, heading toward Glacier National Park. After about 45 minutes, they began feeling better. Within a day, though, they had bad headaches. Hodges left the rental house by August and divided her belongings, leaving some in Alberton and some in her mother's Missoula trailer. She would try and ease her way back into Alberton by living in two worlds. School started on August 20, and Hodges would drive the kids to Alberton, then spend the day at the trailer, she said, trying to detoxify in Missoula of all places, but at least I was out of the house, and I would feel a little better. She stayed in Missoula on weekends. Whenever she could avoid a night in Alberton, she did. I think of the things I did, and I was just nuts, she said. When she did go home, the effect was instantaneous. It would just take seconds, and I would get that awful, it would be like getting drunk. You can't think. It would be like getting stoned against your will. I would wake up in the middle of the night. I wouldn't even know Mark's name some nights. I couldn't think of his name. It was horrible. I was losing my mind, literally. I can't believe what I went through. It became increasingly evident to her that the rest of the family suffered as well. When I noticed Jessie not doing well was after we went home, and I still feel that hurt as much as the original Plume did. She didn't understand at the time, she said, that Jessie, getting these black circles under his eyes, I didn't know that that's a sign that you're not getting oxygen. The sign of an asthmatic. I saw that in Jessie about a month after we went home. He started getting that black-eyed look, the runny nose, the fatigue. 7 years old. Trask had huge stomach problems once we went home, she said. The abdominal pain, the kind Mark was having. Not able to digest food, pain when you ate. Trask had the bad headaches, tremors, muscle pain. He complained about his knees, concentration problems. He was tired and got headaches in the afternoons. His schooling suffered. The main complaint from Mark Hansen was intestinal problems, and he was hospitalized twice. Though the pain was bad, doctors never found a cause. When Mark stopped drinking the water in Alberton, Hodges said, that's when he started to get better. He said that helped a lot. Alberton water was chlorinated. Their dog, Smokey Joe, the black lab that had slept outside the night of the spill and had begun barking a half hour before the Alberton siren went off, had respiratory attacks with a hacking cough. He also seemed neurotic and began breaking out of the yard and fighting other dogs. He went crazy on us, Hodges said. His behavior changed and we couldn't trust him. As family pet, he was too large not to be able to trust. Hodges told her children that Smokey Joe ran away, but Hansen had him euthanized. Going home was tearing her family to pieces. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment, we begin part 3, the long haul. As Lucinda Hodges and others try to live in a town that makes them sick, she reconstitutes ACE into ACCEH, the Alberton Community Coalition for Environmental Health, and begins a letter-writing campaign to government agencies to seek help. Until then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.